Hello everybody. When I made my introduction video, I was saying about my pilot's medical coming up and what I was going to do about it if I passed or failed. You can see the introduction video. I'll put a post up here, a link up here. So here we are. Let's have a look at my pilot's license and my medical. But before we do that, let's just go back about how I got into the flying, what the flying means to me, how I got my license, and then we'll look at the what went wrong, which kind of gives you a clue as to what the outcome of that was. At school, in our studies, we all had posters of the tennis girl with her little short skirt hiked up at the tennis net. I had that poster, I have to admit, I did have that poster, but I also had the 747 jumbo jet cockpit as a poster. I was well into my planes. I've always been into planes. My dad had a pilot's license. He was in the RAF. He flew privately as well. I used to fly with him. I've always been into planes. At school, I joined the RAF cadets. Great, absolutely fantastic. We had a glider. I use the term glider in the loosest possible sense. In the RAF cadets, I was the only kid that could get that glider to fly. It's difficult to believe now, I know, but when I was a kid, or when I was, at school, I was a little skinny little lad and I weighed nothing. And this glider, for lack of a better term, I mean, really it was made out of matchsticks and toilet roll. You'd never let anyone fly one now. But nobody could get the thing off the ground. We used to launch it with a great big bungee on the playing fields. And most people had to make do with skidding along the grass, trying to keep the wings level. I used to get the thing in the air, and that made me the blue-eyed boy in the air cadets, the one that could fly the glider. So when they had a course come up for gliding in Arbroath, I was number one for that course. And I went and did an intensive, I don't know if it was a week or 2 weeks in Arbroath on an RAF base, and I came away with a civilian gliding license. Now at 16, when you can't drive a car, you can ride a moped. That's about the only thing you can do. To be able to fly a glider was just fantastic, especially if you're well into your aircraft. So I really, from that point on, I mean, the RAF cadets did their job. I was hell-bent on joining the RAF and flying Jaguar jets. That's really where I thought I was going to go. There was a slight problem, and that was I failed the medical. Irony there, hey? Because I've got one leg an inch longer than the other, which I didn't even know about until I went for the medical to join the RAF. They said, they didn't appreciate me at first telling them that Douglas Bader had no bloody legs, but he was a flying ace. At which point they pointed out when they're spending millions of pounds training me, they can afford to be picky. Nice, eh? So I got offered, I think it was heavy transport, or suggested that I join the Navy and fly helicopters. Neither of which really appealed to me because I'd set my heart on the Jaguar. Getting a pilot's license is no mean feat. It's not just the flying, it's the fact that you have to do a lot of ground training. You have to do a lot of exams, I think 7 off the top of my head. Things like meteorology, air law. Air law you have to do before you can do your solo. Navigation, your radio, RT, human factors and performance. There's all these things you've got to pass an exam in. It's no mean feat. If you can't do learning, your pilot's license isn't for you, because you are going to have to learn an awful lot. For me, it was a walk in the park. It was my interest. It was my hobby. It's really what I wanted to do. So for me, sitting reading a book about flying was just pleasure for me. So that wasn't the problem for me. The problem for me was that the cost. And I was training. I got my pilot's license in 2002. And prior to that, I'd had a number of false starts where I'd gone and bought some lessons, and I thought I could just buy a lesson when I could afford it, and that would eventually add up to a license. And it doesn't work like that. The problem is that you have to do your lesson, and then you have to do another one soon enough that you haven't forgotten everything from the previous lesson. So you have to sort of keep on it fairly regularly. And that means the best way I would recommend for getting your pilot's license is save up the money, put it in a separate account, keep it ring fenced, and when you've got enough, go and get your license, go and train. I would advise against going and getting one of these packages where you hand over 10 grand to a flying school. There's a lot of flying schools go bust. If the old joke, there's not a lot of money in flying schools. If you want to make millions in flight training, you start with billions. That's the joke, and it's true. So I wouldn't hand over 10k to a flying school for a package. The other thing is, who's to say that you're going to get your training in that amount of time? Everyone takes a different amount of time, so it's not really a guarantee of fixing a price either. I would ring fence the money in an account, and when you've got the money, go and buy your training. When I did mine, 2002, I think I started with 10,000 in the account, and it's not a cheap hobby, flying, and certainly getting your license is expensive. I'll come on to how I reduce some of my costs in a minute. You've got the cost of your training, but you've also got the cost of your books, your exams, your headset. I mean, a headset is quite a few £100s just to get a half decent one. You've also got your medical. Your medical will come on to the costs of that. The medical is expensive. You've got to pass it. No going anywhere without your medical. I joined a local flying club at a local airfield. Turns out they were very good. It was a friend of my father's. I knew them before I even started. They had lovely new planes. I mean, a lot of these flying schools have got really knackered old planes. They're beautiful Robin HR200s, and later on I think it was the Alpha 160, almost the same plane, different engine, a few minor spec changes, but basically the Robin HR200, a couple of Cessnas, a couple of 152s, a couple of 172s. And I joined that, and I had some great instructors. I had 3 or 4 really good instructors, a couple of miserable old buggers I avoided after a little while. But sometimes they're good. You need that person to nag you. You know, these old boys have been flying all their life. What they don't know isn't worth knowing. So I did a lot of flight training in the UK. I got to the point, I soloed at 12 hours, which I think is the minimum that you need, mainly because I had my glider license, so I hit the ground running, really. I mean, I could fly before I even started my training. So typically you start with flying with the instructor. It's real basic stuff. This is how we take off, this is how we turn left, this is how we turn right, up, down, you know, usual stuff. Slowly you start to do circuits where you're landing on the runway, taking off, flying around in a circuit. It's like a compressed flight into 3 to 5 minutes of compressed flight. So you do a takeoff, some flights, some checks, some landings, takeoff, you know, etc., etc. You get the picture. And you do that for a long while, and eventually that moment where your instructor, once you've passed your medical and you've passed your air law, you know when you're getting to that point, your instructor's saying, have you done your air law? Have you got your medical? And that's when you know they're starting to think about sending you on your own. It's a lovely moment, because from that point, officially, when you do your solo, officially you're a pilot. And I was doing quite a lot of circuits with my instructor, and he said to me, well, he said, I think I need a cup of coffee. And I said to him, yeah, good idea. He said, no, you're not having one. Off you go. Shut the canopy, and off I went. They didn't give me any warning at all, and off I went solo. Absolutely fantastic. I didn't realise, you know, you do everything you've done with the instructor, it's exactly the same until you make a turn and you look over and there's nobody in the seat, and it suddenly hits you. You know, you're now up there, you've now got to get it down. But what a fantastic moment. Then after you've done your solo, you start to do more cross-country navigation, a bit more radio. They start to get you to do a lot more. And then eventually you get to qualifying cross-countries and that sort of thing, and navigation exercises. Typically it's fly out to here, fly round, come back. Oh, and talk to that radio while you're out there. Talk to that airfield when you cross over their zone, and that type of thing. And then they ring the other airfields to make sure that, you know, they're all looking out for you. It's a lovely feeling. And I was due to do my qualifying cross country, which was going to be a flight to Cambridge up to Norwich, and Norwich back to my local airfield. And every time it got cancelled because of bad weather, and I was starting to get really disgruntled with this. Then one Sunday morning I had the plane booked, I had the instructor booked, and I was driving to the airfield. Beautiful sunny morning, the forecast was good, hardly any breeze. It was perfect conditions, and I got there and the chief flying instructor said, "Oh, it might get a bit hazy later in the day." Well, bear in mind my cross country is probably going to be an hour and a half to 2 hours. Later in the day probably wasn't going to be my problem. Anyway, he said, "No, I don't think I better send you off." I was so disgruntled on the drive home, I just thought, sod it, I'm going to go and buy some hours in Florida. So that's what I did. I literally bought a cheap flight to Florida. I contacted an organisation called Ormond Beach Aviation. Don't know if they still exist. I went out there. I stayed in a student house with a load of other pilots, and I just banged in hours. Absolutely bloody brilliant it was, and I would advise people doing it actually. So it had a lot of advantages. Had the weather, Florida weather. I know they get a lot of thunderstorms, but we'll come on to that too. But had the weather. Very cheap flying. The price of fuel out there is a fraction of the UK. No landing fees. Even doing instrument approaches, there's no fees from any of the airfields. I was in a house with loads of pilots. The barbecues in the evening in Florida were just talking flying. It was commercial pilots. It was every type of pilot. Novices, but everyone was talking flying. I learned more in that week than I learned at any other point in all my flying training. What else? Yeah, a big one, and this will scare a few people, but in the UK the planes were brand new, beautiful, well maintained, and the planes out there were old dogs really. I mean, we used to joke, how many Cessnas have I got here? Well, there's 4 in that one there. They had a hangar where they were just putting together bits of Cessna to make another aircraft. There wasn't even consistent colouring between a single plane. The tail was one colour, the front was another colour. I mean, they were old dogs, and we got off quite a few engine fails. Now in the UK, if you get an engine fail, you are very unlucky. Very unlucky, and we heard of quite a few. Just in the week that I was there, we had a few. And while that sounds dreadful, learning that it might be your engine this time, it don't have to put you on the ball. I mean, I trained with, is it my turn for my engine to stop this takeoff? And actually it teaches you a huge amount. And I think it made me a better pilot. And I had some huge adventures. They sent me to Sanford, which is the holiday destination for the jumbo jets. I got halfway there and they said, well, we can see you on the transponder, but we can't hear anything from you. So if you can hear us, turn left so many degrees. So I turned left and they said, oh, okay, we can see you on the radar. You can obviously hear us. So carry on. There's a jumbo behind you. You're going to have to clear off the runway very quick. And I'm flying in as a novice pilot on my own in a plane that might pack up any minute with a radio that already packed up and a jumbo jet close behind me. Well, that's an adventure. You might not think so, but that's an adventure. And I think it teaches you things. When I was cycling to the airfield one morning, bloody great Florida thunderstorm. The whole sky was lit up, rain like you can't imagine. I got to the airfield and I said to the guy, what shall I do today? And he said, well, you're going flying, aren't you? I said, what about the storms? He said, we'll fly around them. And that sort of adventure, I flew to Spruce Creek, which is a place where instead of having cars on the drive, they have aeroplanes. You sit at the traffic lights in your Cessna with the cars. You won't get an adventure like that in the UK. And I think I did 10 or 12 hours in Florida and it was perfect. It was just right. So I did my initial training, get my flying skills in the UK. I went and banged hours in the middle in Florida. Then I came back to the UK to do my skills test and about 4 or 5 hours reacquainting myself with the UK. So America has different airspace to us. It has quite a few different the charts are different. There's quite a lot of differences, but the main thing is I found in Florida they use an aircraft like a car. The radio is almost like CB radio. They jump in them, they fly somewhere, they land. It's not like in the UK. It's much stricter in the UK. And I think if you did all your training in the UK, and you can get a CAA license in the UK, in the US, and never fly in the UK, but you can do all your training and get your license in the US. I'd advise against doing that because I think you would have an awful job coming back to the UK after doing that. So I came back, I think with 4 or 5 hours to go before I could take my test. You have to have had, so I think it's 45 hours or 46 hours or something before you can take your skills test. I was ready for my test, but I hadn't reached those hours, again because of my gliding license. So I had a few hours of actually getting back into the UK, slightly stricter ways of working. Once I passed my skills test, I stayed with the same flying club. They had nice planes. I flew HR-200s, beautiful little planes. Lovely, loved them. Cessna 152s, Cessna 172s, Tobago TB10 with a constant speed unit. So I had to do a bit of training to convert to constant speed propeller. Yeah, it was good, apart from a number of things, and there was a number of things that wrecked it for me. The first was booking a plane. Getting a plane at the weekend, you had to book weeks and weeks in advance, and you didn't know what the weather was going to be like by then. So you booked your plane, you finally got your booking, you got to your airfield, and the weather was pants. Getting a plane during the weekend was nearly impossible. Everyone was trying to do training. The flying club makes their money out of the training, so they don't want you taking the plane off for the day on a Saturday anyway. So really you had very limited flying. The other problem was that to take the plane for the day, so say you wanted to go somewhere, do something with the plane, you had to do a minimum of 4 hours flying. Well, 4 hours flying in the UK is pretty much the whole of the UK in a plane like that. And it's something like the TB10. You can be in Scotland in an hour and a half virtually. So, 4 hours meant you could get to Scotland and back virtually. So you were doing 4 hours flying, which you didn't necessarily want to do. You might do an hour out to wherever you wanted to go, do whatever you wanted to do, and then you'd come back, do it in 3 hours like that, just to get your hours that you were going to pay for anyway, and that just didn't work for me. So I tended to go flying, take an hour, booked on a Saturday, fly my mate over his house. I soon got bored of that. The other problem the club had was that they had a currency rule for the club, which was something like if you haven't flown for 4 weeks, you had to do a check ride with an instructor, which meant that basically you were safe. So it was not, in theory, it was a quick circuit with an instructor. Jump in the plane, once round in the circuit, 3 to 5 minutes, and so long as you didn't do anything stupid, the instructor would say, right, you're okay to fly. The reality was that the instructors, they don't make any money jumping in a plane with you for 5 minutes. They're going to spend their day there trying to get instructor hours. So invariably, that 5-minute once round the block in the plane to make sure that you were still safe turned into, and I'm not saying this because I screwed it up, I was pretty good at jumping back in the plane after really quite a long time, but they turned that check ride into a half hour, 45 minutes, or even an hour, at which point you've spent your hour that you were going to go flying, effectively flying an instructor around and being charged for him. So suddenly I found that the flying club didn't work for me, and I got bored of the flying. I got bored of being constantly check ridden by the instructors all the time, and unless you were going to fly big hours, which you were never able to do because you couldn't book the plane and you couldn't afford to take it for 4 hours just because you wanted to go somewhere one day, which they didn't want you to do anyway. So it didn't really work for me, and I had to decide to shit or get off the pan, and I chose to buy into a group. I looked at a number of groups. Some of them had beautiful Robin DR400s. They were all polished in a perfect hangar, and the group used to go and take turns at polishing it and cleaning the windows and wiping down the wheels, and they'd say, oh, we don't fly to a grass strip because we get grass on the bottom of the plane. That wasn't for me. I wanted to join a group and go flying, not join a group and polish an aeroplane. So I looked around a bit more, and I found a group with a Grob 109B touring motor glider. Now, I'll put some pictures on here, of course. It's a funny looking creature. If you imagine a single engine piston like a Robin HR200 breeding with a glider, the child would be the Grob 109B. At first I was a bit sceptical, but actually it's been an amazing plane. It flies like a single engine piston, so it flies just like an HR200. I mean, the performance statistics are pretty much the same. The speeds, airspeed over the hedge type stuff. The approach is very different, but the speeds are very similar. Slightly underpowered, but I think the Robin HR200 was as well. But the Grob turned out to be a really good aircraft. It's a solid aircraft. It's not one of these what I call made out of Band-Aid plasters and plasticine and wires. It's not a glorified hang glider. It's a proper solid aircraft. It's got decent performance. Cruises at 90 knots quite happily. But it has one killer feature. Its killer feature, it has a number of killer features actually, but the real one is cost of flying. £55 an hour. You won't get £55 an hour from any other aircraft. And because it's a touring motor glider, shut the engine off and pay nothing for your flying. You're only paying for engine time. There's one guy in the group had 8 hours flying one day. Perfect thermal conditions. Flew right up the east coast for nothing. And the other thing I like about it is, the old if the engine stops question. With most of these aircraft, including the HR200, the Cessnas, the engine stops, you're looking for a field very quickly. With the Grob, you have lunch and then fly home. I mean, it glides. It doesn't glide like a performance glider. It's got a bloody great engine on the front, for God's sake. It's not going to fly like a performance glider, but it does glide. And the old joke, the engine stops, and you have lunch, and then you wonder about where you're going to go after that. The other advantages of the Grob, as I say, proper solid aircraft, which I liked. It was based at, or still is based at North Weald, which isn't that far from me. A good group, that's the key. A diverse group. Different people come from gliding, from long hour flying. We had a guy in the group who was a private jet pilot. We've had all sorts of different pilots in the group, and you learn different things from the group. They're a good group, as in that they go out and do things rather than just polish the plane. There's been a number of other benefits of the Grob group. The main one is the group. It's a good group. It's a nice bunch of guys, very diverse. Some of them have come from being gliding instructors. But the big advantage of the Grob was that if you've got a single engine piston, so you've spent a lot of money getting your single engine piston license, the hours that you fly on the Grob count towards your single engine piston. So you're clocking hours against your single engine piston license at glider rates, really, at £55 an hour, and that was its killer feature for me. The cost of running just so low. I'll come on to the costs. I've also had quite a few adventures with it. I've had a bit of flying at Enstone, where there's a training organisation that specialises in the Grob and TMGs, and I've had some fantastic adventures there. Flying with one guy, handlebar moustache from the RAF, and we were probably about 10 kilometres away from the airfield, and he just said to me, right, engine off, fly home, land and roll clear of the runway, please. Wow, bang, you're in it. What an adventure. I did manage to do it. The good news with the Grob is if you cock it up really bad, you start the engine and you get another go. But I did manage with a bit of side slipping. I was too high, which is probably better than being too low. I'll try and pop the video in here, but there was a bit of a rather uncomfortable side slipping to lose some height at the last minute and then roll clear of the runway. Absolutely fantastic. I've had some great adventures at Enstone, and initially I pushed back at doing a lot of training at Enstone, but actually I've really loved doing my training there. I've had a couple of trips over to France with the plane. Once I jokingly put on Facebook I'd come over to buy cheese. I got some abuse for that, which I probably deserved. But flying it over the channel to France, great, what an adventure. And as I say, flying with others, flying to barbecues at other flying clubs, just going flying. There's one guy who's hell-bent on soaring. I've been with him. That bloody engine's hardly ever on. He's got the engine off the whole time. He's come from a gliding background, that's his thing. And I was flying it like a single engine piston, when he got in it, he was flying it like a glider. So a completely different way of flying, and that's great, and it's a great group. So here we get on to the what went wrong. Well, I didn't fail my medical, but I didn't pass it either. And this is the interesting part. My medical now, age 61, is every year, with an ECG every other year. And last year I scraped by. My weight was on the limit. My asthma was just about under control. I did a peak flow test and it was okay, but not great. My blood pressure was on the limit, and I had to record that for another week or two afterwards to validate it. And I scraped through. I've spent a year working my bollocks off on my health. I've lost 2 stone. I go running now. I never thought I'd run ever. I go running. I don't think I've ever been as fit, actually. And the irony is, I went back for my medical. And the medical problem that I'd self-grounded myself for, which was to do with my ear, turned out to be post-COVID, or long COVID, as they call it. That didn't appear to be a problem, but it would appear the medical has just got much stricter. So in the past, I would do a peak flow for my asthma, in the tube, and I measured that, and actually it was bloody good. But now you don't just do a peak flow. You now have to go on a machine that measures all sorts of different things and graphs them, and then prints out 100 figures, one of which was 0.2 out of limits. And he said to me, yeah, you're going to have to go and do a special test for your breathing. As I say, what I'm blowing on a peak flow is probably better than a lot of people blow without asthma. But, as technology comes in, they're able to test these things to the nth degree. And my feeling is that the medical has got much more difficult. I don't believe it's just that I'm getting older, though that is obviously an element of it. The medical is getting more difficult. And as this technology comes in, the Civil Aviation Authority are able to test at a much more detailed level, and of course they're a regulatory panel. They're going to test to the nth degree, and so as those bits of equipment come in, the cost of your medical goes up because your aviation medical examiner has to buy that equipment and somehow make the money back on that, so it gets more expensive. But so do the number of things that you could potentially fail on goes up exponentially as well. So prior to this medical, I'd self-grounded, which meant that I was out of hours. I wasn't current. I was going to have to do my skills test again. Now, typically in the last 6 to 8 years, when I've actually been in this GROB group, I've been hanging on to my hours by my fingernails, really. At the end of when that time limit comes up, I'm having to count my hours up and say, oh shit, I've got to bang another X hours in before this date, and then I can just do a check ride with an instructor to keep my pilot's license current. And I've been having to work quite hard to keep within those limits. If I now have a medical every year that is going to add another check that's going to take another so many weeks, a cardiologist check that's going to take however many pounds and so many weeks, the extra test on this, which is going to cost another 50 something pounds and another few weeks. Not only is it suddenly becoming very expensive to hang on to that license, but actually I'm going to struggle even more because the weeks or months that I'm wasting getting through my medical, I use the term wasting, I'm sure somebody will argue with me on that, but spending on getting through my medical, I'm not flying. Now, if I was hanging on to my license prior to the medical, I certainly wasn't going to be keeping it after taking 2 months out of every year, now that I have to have a medical every year. So I put my big boy pants on, and I've decided that shit will get off the pan like last time. The license has to go. So it doesn't really go. It sounds dreadful, but you don't ever lose the license. The license is for life. To get it back, I would have to pass the medical. So obviously I'd still have to pass the medical, and maybe in 5 years' time it's going to be ridiculous. Well, your fingernails aren't growing fast enough, whatever they've come up with. So I'd still have to pass the medical, but I'd still have to do the skills test. So actually I'm no different to where I am now. So I've decided I'm not going to give up the license. I'm going to hang it up for now. I'm not going to sell my headset. I'm just going to put it to one side. I'm not going to fly for now, and I'm going to sell my share in the Grob Group. So if you're interested in fantastically good, cheap flying, drop me a line, comment, and let me have your email. I don't know if you can email me on YouTube. I don't know. I haven't been doing it long enough. But anyway, drop me a comment, because there's going to be a share coming up for sale. A share in the Grob is £4,000. It's, in flying terms, it's nothing. Cost of flying is so tiny. I mean, you can spend 4,000 at your local flying club and own nothing for it at the end of it, and have to book planes with everybody else weeks ahead. So the share is £4,000. There's some costs which I'm happy to go through, which is the for the hangarage, the insurance, you know, the overheads, the maintenance and whatever. So you pay this much per month, whether you fly it or not, and that's your overhead cost. To be honest, that's reasonably small. I mean, if you've leased a car, it's a fraction of that. You know, we're not talking big money here. Per month, 100 and something pounds I think I pay, and I pay a little bit more to cover flying hours, so that I've got some in the, you know, buffer for flying hours as well. I'm not going to give up my flying, full stop. So in my introductory video, one of the things I was saying was that if the medical is a problem, and I did predict that it might be, I would go on and do paragliding and paramotoring. So, you know, the paraglider, I think we've all seen them, and the paramotors that fly over. The irony is that I'm now fit enough. I've lost 2 stone. I was probably a bit chubby for a paraglider before. I've lost that 2 stone. I've got fitter so that I can do the run and I can carry the equipment on my back and the weight and stuff. So the irony is that I'm now fit enough to do paragliding, but I've failed my medical. Anyway, I'll take you guys along when I train for paragliding, because I think that's going to be an absolute riot. I'm quite looking forward to it. So I'm somewhat saddened that I've had some great adventures with my pilot's license, and I'm going to have to put it on the shelf for a while. And hopefully it's not on the shelf forever, but even if it is, I've got some adventures to look forward to with the paragliding. If you're looking at gaining your pilot's license, or you've got a pilot's license, or maybe you're in the same position as I am, then by all means comment. Love to hear from you. Your comments mean somebody's getting something from these videos. It takes me quite a lot of time messing about with them, so getting some comments from you guys. I mean, I got a lot of negative comments from my last political rant, so getting a few good positive comments from you guys would be great. Also subscribe and like. It makes making these videos all worthwhile.